Yeah, y'all didn't know I was gonna get that logo that fast. I had a lot of people saying, "Hey, bro, you need to get a logo. You need to get a logo." Got a logo. But anyway, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to Stack Racks Boxing. Stack Racks TV. Whatever you want to call it, right? Well, we talk boxing and we talk from time to time, right? The main purpose of this channel, the main prerogative of this channel, the primary purpose of this channel, is for you to sit back, relax, enjoy the content, Mac Jack, Slack Jack, and Jack Jack Jack. Today it's going to be a lot more of a detailed video, a detailed breakdown. Carlos Adames versus Ammo Williams, at 160 pounds. This fight right now is going to be on the undercard of Shakur Stevenson and Teofimo Lopez. I believe that Carlos Adames has a chance to pull this off in a spectacular fashion. And I'm going to break that all down in this video, but I'm going to start with Carlos Adames and Hamza Shiraz, right? I believe Carlos won that fight, easy. I didn't believe that fight was as close as the judges thought. His level changes, his feints, pushing Hamza Shiraz back. The amount that he was landing on Hamza Shiraz, his counter punching ability, right? Seemed like every jab that he hit Hamza Shiraz with landed, right? Again, in that fight, I was impressed with, the strategic pressure that Carlos was able to bring. His gas tank in that fight, from 1 to 12, he was game. He was ready. He was searching for the fight. And like I said before, I felt like he came out on top in that fight, but unfortunately, with boxing, and with these judges, it could go either way. Ammo Williams coming into this fight with a lot of momentum. Since that Hamza Shiraz fight, he's been able to get 3 fights since. He's been able to stay active. Unfortunately for Carlos, he wasn't given that same opportunity. He was waiting on a rematch with Hamza. Hamza ends up moving up to 168. Beating Edgar Berlanga in a devastating fashion. And ultimately, that pushed Carlos to the wayside, right? Fortunately for Carlos, he gets an opportunity now. But, it's been a shame, that a guy like, especially as skillful as Carlos, hasn't been able to get in there, in some time now. Especially when he's been looking to be active. Ammo Williams, like I said before, coming off a lot of momentum. He beat up 3 nobodies, but, he struggled with one of those nobodies, right? Knocked out 2 guys that nobody heard of and struggled in a unanimous decision win against a tall, lanky guy, who was 35 years old and was a very patient fighter. Carlos is not a patient fighter. Carlos is a guy that is steady giving you different level changes, right? He's a guy that's coming in there bringing the pressure. A lot of feints, a lot of aggression, calculated aggression. He knows how to work behind his jab and set up his big shots. And I think this fight could be a nightmare for a guy like Ammo Williams, especially with how hungry Carlos is coming into this fight. Ammo can win this fight if he works on his boxing ability. Using the ring in there, working behind the jab, not throwing those pity-pat combinations on the inside against a guy like Carlos. Everything that Carlos throws has heat on it, right? I like to refer to Carlos as a habitual stalker, right? How some stalkers might follow you home from school, follow you to the Walmart, right? Carlos is one of them guys you like, oh, babe, I forgot my charger in the car. You go get the charger. He out there. You like, babe, is it cold outside? You open the door. You look. He right there. You go in the bathroom. You like, hey, babe, I'm about to go brush my teeth. You go in there, cut the light on. He behind you. He's one of those guys that brings that much pressure. Ammo Williams coming into this fight, he's going to have to scrap, everything that he did in his last 3 fights post that Hamza Shiraz devastating loss, right? He's going to have to come into this fight and be a fighter that he has never been. Right? So I believe that the likelihood of that changing or him getting better, I don't see it. That's me personally, right? Again, pity-pat shots, not working off a jab, not utilizing the ring. That's going to work against him against a guy like Carlos. Carlos, he bring a lot of steam. He bring a lot of heat. He bring a lot of pressure. And unfortunately, I can't see Ammo Williams being able to handle that, especially with the gas tank that he's had in his last 3 fights. Even in those knockout wins, you could see him gassed out. Even in that unanimous decision win, right? You could see him gassed out. And running out of gas against a guy like Carlos and then resulting to, fighting on the inside because you're so tired, that's going to work against him. Like I said before, Carlos is a guy that throws everything hard. He works behind his jab. He sets up his big shots. It's not no pity pat shots with a guy like Carlos, right? You know, it's not no working behind a jab, you know, and nothing coming behind it, right? Again, Carlos is a guy that brings that pressure, and I could see Ammo Williams getting stopped in this fight in a devastating fashion.